Hello, all of you beautiful bitches out there in the world. Welcome back to the Sex, Drugs, and Jesus podcast. I have with me my favorite two people to have a three-way with, Erik DaRosa and Marc Fernandes of the From Survivor to Thriver podcast. Now, you've seen them before, and we talk about all kinds of filth, knowledge, wisdom, and everything in fucking between. And today, as you can see, I've grown a beard. Mark has lost his virginity all over again and gone back to being a little Catholic schoolboy, getting his catechism. You do look right for the raping by a priest today, Mark. I must say,
Hallelujah. 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 Hallelujah.
Mark was an altar boy.
I was an altar boy. I was never raped by a priest. There was, unfortunately, a lot of that happened in my hometown. One of the worst offenders in the Catholic Church, Father Porter, spent a very long and awful amount of time abusing many children and was covered up for close to 30 years. So I don't know if we want to talk about that, though. Let's talk about things that are more fun than.
like today, we're going to be talking about Erik DaRosa's mental health shit, as he would call it. And we're going to be talking about Mark shit too, which does have to do a lot with the Catholic priest. I don't believe this new pope and this announcement he's made about how he's going to right all these wrongs of what these altar boys are getting fucked in their mouths and their little pussies and everything like that. I don't believe anything of the Vatican says anyways because they're full of shit. But how the fuck are you going to fix that problem within the Catholic Church? Wait for more people to get raped and then suddenly send them to jail? I mean,
No, I'm not going to argue with you because I don't think he can right the wrongs, but I think. And look, I'm not trying to give him too much credit. I am on record of my issues with the Catholic Church. But the thing I will say is at least the Pope is actually acknowledging it. Like, we've got thousands of years of this abuse that has literally been ignored. So at least the fact that he's like, yeah, some shit went down. I mean, the first step to knowing you have a problem is admitting it, right? So I'm not ready to throw him an absolution party, but at least they're doing that. Really, truly. And I mean this honestly. I'm not trying to have an argument about it or push it into that, but it is such a huge fucking step for him to be like, some shit went down. Because before this, no one was. They were writing checks and trying to sweep it under the rug, man. That's all it's been. That's all it's been. I could feel your attitude go.
I've said what I needed to say just with this
Okay.
love
All
right.
right.
Can we
I
acknowledge?
I just have some hope. This much.
Can we acknowledge since the last podcast we now have a new king?
Look,
We did acknowledge it. The best part about it is
I just said acknowledge is all we got to do.
my favorite thing
And
is
I hope
the
Harry-
onion.
I hope
Send me
Harry's on a
onion.
plane,
Yes,
flying
Harry's
home,
on a plane.
never to go back to London again. That was him.
It's probably, but my favorite part of that though, it was an Onion article I saw, which was a picture of King Charles III. It just said, the headline was brilliant. It just said, 73-year-old man finally gets first job. I thought that was brilliant.
the shade of it all. I love it.
But you know what's even shadier? Do you know the stories of King Charles I and King Charles II? The
I
first
do.
two of his name?
I do, and there was
They're
a whole
ugly.
there
They're
was a
ugly,
whole
Eric. Tell us about the ugliness.
there was a whole thing about whether or not he was even going to take Charles, right? Because he had 3 names that he could have chosen from.
So, King Charles I, how did he meet his end?
I'll let you tell the story.
They beheaded that son of a bitch. Off of his head. And then King Charles II ran away because he was about to get the throne. And he just watched his dad ran away to France. And then what got him there? I know he died too, and it was ugly, but what was it? Was it like cholera or something? Like something did him in.
Yeah, I think he died from typical middle age, not middle age like our age, but middle ages. Like Renaissance plagues and shit,
Syphilis?
and locusts, and yeah.
Syphilis?
Well, I don't know.
Yeah,
This
like-
would have helped him. I have my plague bearer earring.
Oh, very
That's
nice.
what this is.
But yes, if I was Harry, Duke of was he Duke of Sussex now? I would immediately
William
ask
is Edinburgh.
yeah, Prince Prince of Wales. So I would immediately get on a plane and I would never come back to London again, just like how I broke with certain members of my family. I think it's time for him to acknowledge a real clean split from his family, and what he's doing on the mental health front is amazing.
Yes.
And so I applaud him for that. He was here actually like 3 or 4 weeks ago.
He's batting the polo
He
balls
was
around.
he was playing here playing polo. So if you're listening, Harry, make your new life in California and stay there and keep doing all the good you're doing.
Yeah,
If you're
absolutely.
listening, Harry, I want to know if the curtains match the drapes. That's what I want from that man. Fuck all, I mean, policy great. I want to suck red dick.
By the way, every time I look at this screen, it's like looking at Lando Calrissian.
Oh, you do,
Right?
So to the new one, to the young.
Yeah.
Why am I forgetting his real name? All I can think of is his alter ego. What is the actor's
That
name?
delicious, sexy chocolate man.
He's gorgeous. But all I'm thinking about is his alter ego that he does all the dance videos of, and I can't remember his actual name. Help me out here, people.
I've never seen any of the new ones. I've only seen the original 3. But let's let Devane
hijack
take
this
his show
episode.
back. Let him take his show back.
Come back to you. So, Eric, let's lead in with your mental health issues here. So, you mentioned you returned from a trip recently. What's on the forefront of your mind regarding your very colorful history with mental health? We have everything from OCD to PTSD to fear of sleeping and everything. Wh- What do you want to say?
So yeah, it's a like a menagerie of mental illnesses
An
and
orgy of mental health issues.
yes, except an orgy is much more enjoyable than dealing with intrusive
Depends on
thoughts
who's there.
and
Depends
that's
on
true
who's
too. That's
there.
true. But yeah, as you said, I just got back. I was in Louisville. You'll be proud of me, Mark. I received applause when I said Louisville, and I had been practicing it for about a week, so I would say it correctly. So I wouldn't sound like
You've
the
gotten so much better.
East Coaster that
It's
I
real.
was.
That's close.
And so I was speaking at the Walden School, which is a private school. Mark, you remember Julian Haley Rose. And so Haley is a teacher at that school and introduced me to a bunch of the administrators and the principal of the high school. And so they invited me to come speak to the parents on Thursday night about the importance of having mental health conversations with their children. And I helped coach them a bit in how to go about that. And then I spoke to the high school on Friday. And yeah, so what's front and center on my mind, Devane, is this whole idea about, you're not alone. And, there's no need any longer for any of us to have to suffer in silence. And that's really what I was speaking to the kids about. And it all came kind of full circle to my own personal story. And you had mentioned, yes, OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorder, where for me, the obsessive side was intrusive thoughts. And we can go into more detail about what those are and how those manifest as the show goes on. And the compulsive side, which for me was, doing everything in threes. So for instance, making sure every time I left the house, I would have to check the doorknob, make sure the door was locked. I would pull on it 3 times. It would make me feel safe, secure, in control. And if I did it a 4th time, I would have to start that ritual all over again. And we can certainly go into that more. That, along with anxiety, which going back to when I was 7, is really the first time I can remember kind of having the manifestations of both the mental illness side of anxiety, but also the physical side. And you mentioned fear of sleeping and inability to sleep, and that was all a function of my anxiety at the time and what was happening in my head around the intrusive thoughts. And then, yeah, just recently, just less than a year ago, I was finally diagnosed with PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder for your audience members. And my PTSD relates to childhood emotional trauma. There's lots and lots of different ways that PTSD can be classified. I think a lot of us think of PTSD as, traditional people in the military. And I know for me, when I first heard PTSD, not only was I super excited to finally know that we could kind of put a name and a frame around something that I had, which also helped me understand all of the symptoms that I was exhibiting. But I also immediately thought, hey, wait a minute, I wasn't in SEAL Team 6, like a couple of friends of Mark and I. And, I've never fought in a war, but as I've investigated it with my therapist and my energy healer and done a lot of the work over the past year, I've realized that PTSD really just means, post is after, traumatic is suffering some sort of a trauma. And so after that trauma, stress happens. It can be significant. And the disorder part is when your brain sort of gets disorganized. And so clearly for me, having grown up with, the situation that I did, it's no surprise that there's PTSD there. And then there's also a secondary component of that, and I know Mark can also share in this as well. Living in New York City on 9/11, I was there, Mark was there, our wives were there, and I never realized how much the 9/11 incident and sort of the days and weeks following changed the course of my life for the remainder of my 10 years in New York City. And then just how it impacted me on so many different levels and really heightened my anxiety and just kind of threw me into a state of kind of constant unease, if you will. So that's kind of the 30,000-foot level, and I'll throw it back to you, and we can go down any kind of road on that you want.
Thank you for that breakdown. Mark, I want you to be thinking about, so this conversation here is going to be like dark and deep. I want you to think about a light song you can play us on one of your guitars behind you when we close out the show. I want to close the show with you strumming us a little ditty, if you will. So just be thinking about it. And
I did Erik request.
Yeah, I'm going to request, and he has to play whatever I request.
Oh shit!
You just did it. I'll be nice. I'll be nice.
I'll mute in tune so I'm ready when that comes up.
That's right. I'll be nice.
Well, it's interesting because, listening to Erik, sort of filter out his journey. It's one of the things. I am also a trauma denier. It's a new term of, since it's called.
I like that.
Susan and Jesus. Yeah, we all play that game, right? Like, who's got the bigger dick? Who's the sexiest? Who's this? And then in the mental health world, we all minimize trauma. We're like, Erik even while explaining his own diagnosis, kind of did it in a short thing of being like, well, I've never been in a war, so why would I have PTSD? And I'll never forget, talking to my therapist in this last bout of talk therapy, and she was like, oh, in New York, when were you in New York? And I put the years out, and she was like, oh, so you were there for 9/11? And I very just sort of like off the cuff, I'm like, oh yeah, future wife worked in Tower 2. But we were lucky ones. I feel like I have a lot of survivor's guilt. And she just went, stop. What did you just say? And I was like, yeah, I mean, we went through some shit, And then, to dig a little deeper, I spent a month actually volunteering down at the site, feeding and working with. At that point, we still called them rescue workers. It was really just a salvage and in a body recovery sense at that point, and lost 2 colleagues on one of the flights. And many people that my wife and I worked with were unfortunately tragically touched by it. So yeah, it's this thing where, I feel like guys do it more than girls, to be a little sexist about it, but we just minimize it. We're like, how sick do I deserve to be? It wasn't that bad. And the fact of the matter is, we don't get to understand or measure how our brains react. And that's one of the most important things I think of what Erik brought up about this idea of disorder is it isn't necessarily the trauma that causes the problem. It's how your brain then gets rewired and how it reacts to other situations, which it essentially reacts like the trauma is either re-happening or it's trying to protect you from it, right? There's kind of two ways that disorder shows up. Pretty much anybody who's had, and just about all of us have, if you've had something that hard in your life where, you've been disrupted in such a way, there's a chance you'll develop PTSD. And you don't necessarily develop it like at the time, right? You don't like come home from war and it happens right away. Sometimes PTSD doesn't show up till 4, 5, 6, 10 years later, depending on circumstances, other things. So it could be a slippery thing to sort of diagnose, and it can show up, right? People could be like, oh, you have anxiety, but they may not know that it's actually caused by it. So it is one of those things.
I feel that way about disasters like hurricanes and things like that, like we have Fiona, tearing apart
Absolutely.
Puerto Rico right now, and like we've had Hurricane Katrina, and stuff like that, where you see all the dead bodies just bobbing away down the street, floating in the water. And so in my head, I go, okay, what is the how do you deal with the mental health, for all of these other things? And I hate the fact that PTSD is so associated with the military. But the way it was described to me, as a military veteran, for us, PTSD was a reasonable fear of a loss of life or limb,
Mhm.
or something like that. Regardless of how anybody from the outside looks at it, if you had that fear, then it's PTSD for you. It doesn't matter what it is, and it is not just for people in the military. Eric, what I want you to do, because you mentioned before that you have like panic attacks and things like that that happen. Now, if there's something else you want to say on the PTSD, go ahead and say that first. But I want you to do this to describe for me like the worst panic attack that you ever had in great detail.
Sure. I'm thinking through because there was one that I had, which was very, very recent in October of last year. But I'm going to go back to right before I started to see a therapist. So I was 33 years old. Amy and I had been away. Actually, there's an even better one than that. So I was in my office. This was in 2006, and it led to my second dissociative episode. So I was sitting in my office, feeling really good earlier that day, and it was leading up to a 3-day weekend. It was September, so it was Labor Day weekend. It was a Friday, and I was gonna go meet Amy at her office as I did, and she and I were gonna go home and have a fun weekend. And suddenly I'm in my office and I can feel myself start to sweat. And suddenly I have a thought in my head, which was kind of a terrifying thought. I don't think that the actual thought is important, but it was a terrifying thought. And I just remember trying to push that thought away. And the more I would try to push that thought away, the more it would start to spiral in my head. And so that's the intrusive thought piece of OCD. And as that was happening, I was sweating. I could literally feel my vision start to close in. I was losing concentration. I still knew I was in my office. I didn't I didn't know why it was happening. I remember thinking to myself, I can't believe this is happening again. I thought this was done. I thought it was treated. I thought I had finished with this. And I remember now kind of visibly shaking, and my body just starting to feel really unsettled and having a thought at the same time in my head of, I can't let anybody see this. And so I was battling to put up the facade on one hand, while on the other side, I was now in what you would call a true, like, fight or flight response. Like, my amygdala is, you know, fully in charge of my brain. It's taken over my body. I'm in a complete state of panic, and all I can remember thinking is, if I don't get out of my office now and get to Amy's office, which was 3 or 4 blocks away, I don't know how I'm gonna get out of here this weekend. And I somehow get up, took the elevator, walked down 6th Avenue. I got to her office, and as I got there, just tears began streaming. And for me, panic attacks have always resulted in that type of a response, right? So there's always that the panic and the fight or the flight and the build of anxiety. And then suddenly the tears started flowing. And I remember saying to her, I need to get into a conference room because I need to call Dr. K. This was my therapist in New York at the time. And I called him, and I told him what I was going through. I hadn't seen him in about 2 years. I had been off medication, but I just remember sitting there, like, shaking and thinking, I don't know if I'm gonna survive this. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to get through this again. And and he talked to me, and, there was a little bit of crisis intervention on the phone, and he said, I can see you first thing on Monday morning. Do you think you can get through the weekend? And I think I said something like, I'm not sure, but Amy's around. And so I got home, and I actually, I've talked about this before. When I come out of a panic attack like that, I typically then go into a state of euphoria. And so as we get on the subway, I started to suddenly feel my spirits lift. And it was as though my body had just been shot up with a bunch of dopamine and serotonin and all those feel good chemicals. And I thought, oh wow, like, this one's pretty short lived. Things are gonna be good. And then I got home, and 2 or 3 hours later, the obsessive thought loop went into overdrive, and the anxiety and the fear and the panic led to an inability for me to get off of the couch. And 3 days later, I came to. I had had my second full-blown, we'll call it, now they call them psychotic breaks, dissociative episodes. They used to call them nervous breakdowns, where essentially I had gone into such a state of panic and anxiety that it's very similar to doing a Control Alt Delete on the computer, where you completely reboot your computer. My brain was in the process of being rebooted to protect itself and to protect me. And I didn't sleep much that weekend. I I was sweating. I was anxious. I remember Amy said I was talking, but I don't remember anything I said. I don't remember anything from that weekend. All I remember is not eating, not sleeping, being so frightened that some type of harm was going to come to me or to somebody that I love. And it must have been around 5 o'clock on that Monday of the long weekend. And Amy called a friend of ours who's a therapist and said, I'm not sure what to do. Her ex-therapist is going to see him tomorrow. And I remember her saying, my apartment's unlocked. There's Klonopin in the drawer. My therapist had been talking about that being a potential drug that we would use to help with my anxiety. And so Amy drove us in over to her apartment, and I remember I took the Klonopin as she prescribed it, and within 15 or 20 minutes, all I could think about was food. All I wanted to do was eat. I was so hungry. And I kind of, again, went into this state of euphoria. It's really hard to describe. And I know people that have suffered with bipolar can experience sort of like the manias and the depressive episodes. But for me, it was suddenly like this fog had lifted. I ate a tremendous amount of food and I fell asleep. And Amy could not wake me. Like she was shaking me, and it was the first time that I had had kind of a restful night's sleep in probably 5 or 6 days. And that set off really what was my mental health journey back in 2006. And I think back on it now, and it still gives me kind of the chills. I can still vividly just remember kind of where I was on that Friday afternoon. And then Monday, 6 p.m., kind of, we went to a Boston market because that was the only thing I was craving at the time. And here I am, speaking about it. And I've had one other since, but nothing really comes close to that experience for me.
So, so two questions. Amy, is this like a wife, girlfriend,
Mm,
therapist?
Wife,
Okay.
wife, yes.
And then also, when these panic attacks happens, would you say you feel like you're being possessed or not?
No, I don't feel like I'm being possessed. I feel as though I'm back. And Mark actually heard me on the phone a couple of times in December of this past year when I went through my last one. And so he may be able to describe it from that side as well. But I I feel as though I'm kind of that 7-year-old kid again. I feel extremely fearful. I don't trust myself. I don't trust anyone around me. That if that makes sense. Um, and I have the ability to convince myself of all of these horrible thoughts, and it can be anything from the fear that I'm going to harm a loved one, which is, I mean, you want to talk about things that are so far out of character, and that's typically what happens with intrusive thoughts. They are things that are so far out of your own personal character. To that I'm going to die, and I've had situations where I have convinced myself that I am going to die, and where I will lie in bed and just think, how much time do I have left? Just literally being convinced. My mind has now convinced me.
Okay, then Mark, tell me, like, since Eric said you've heard some of these episodes before, how did it sound to you? How
It
did
doesn't. It's interesting because it's the person, but
Mm.
you can tell they're not all there, for lack of a better term. Like they're like the way that Eric describes it is like having those younger fears. There is a sense of, you can tell from the sound of their voice and the things that they're describing, that they can't make sense of what's actually happening, right? Because I feel like at this point, it's not fully dissociative. Like there are associations happening where the person is able to tell you like where they are and what is going on. And so I feel like there's this small amount of understanding that like, hey, like my anxiety and these intrusive thoughts and this sort of spiral isn't necessarily a reaction to something that is going on, but the chemistry of it and how the person is feeling is so real and it's so terrifying. And but it's difficult for them to put it into words or to even describe what they're afraid of, right? What's going to happen? Everything, all the terrible things. Something's going to happen, to his wife Amy, to him. I'm never going to make it home. I'm never going to see like, and it's not one thought; it's all of them. And they just kind of like, I'm watching it, or
Yeah, it
I
is.
must be doing a good job,
It
and
is.
they kind of pile on each other. And
It's
I've
like a
never,
it's like a kaleidoscope,
it's
really,
like
is
a
the way
collider, yeah, it is. And I've never had a dissociative episode, but I have had anxiety attacks and panic attacks. And the thing that I find the most disturbing about it when I'm in it, and also hearing Eric go through it, is the fixations, like those move fast, but the level of fear and the absolute like just panic, that doesn't change. That stays at like a 10, even though the situation's changed. Does that make sense? Because it's like you're thinking about this happening to you or to someone else or this other situation, and the panic stays right at the top of the list. But what you're fixated on actually continually changes and comes in and out and can compound and then break apart again. It's insane.
And you describe it really well, Mark. And the other thing that I think that I notice what happens is all of those things are in overdrive, but it feels to me like time stands still, and it feels like, you know, a, a, a hour is like the longest. And I find myself clock watching a lot when I've been in these episodes and just thinking like, oh my gosh, it's got to be like 10 hours have passed, and I'll look and it's been 5 minutes because, my brain is and my physical body is in such overdrive that, things are just happening, as you said, so incredibly rapidly. And it's almost like a little viewfinder when we were kids. It's just like slides that are just furiously passing in front of me, and I'm trying to push them away, and another one comes in and I try to push that one away. And then, I look at the clock and it's like, is this day ever going to end? Like, is this feeling ever going to end? Like, how much longer am I going to have to and I'm going to use the first word of our podcast. How much longer am I going to have to survive this? Because that is really, I think at the crux, that's what it is. It's really being in survival mode and living in survival mode.
It's interesting too, because I've suffered a lot more from depression than I have from panic or anxiety. And there's a time element in that as well. And look, we know time is relative. No matter how often you watch the clock, it's how it feels, right? And there is a huge time element to it of, my worst depressive episodes are those, up all night trying to decide whether or not you actually want to do the day tomorrow when the day happens. And then the clock crawls. But then it can speed up too. Like all of a sudden you close your eyes and maybe you sleep for a bit and it feels like a full night, and it wasn't. It was an hour, or vice versa. But and we know so little about this. Like that's the thing. Like we're literally at the dawn of truly understanding neurology and how our brains work, which to me is sort of frightening. That we're essentially this giant meat computer that we are essentially beholden to, and we have very little understanding of how it operates us and our body, and especially when you think about how memory works, our understanding, feeling of time, our emotions, how we create attachment, how we process trauma. Like these things we're really just starting to begin to understand. Was not, Freud and Jung were not thousands of years ago. And they were 120.
Like yesterday.
Yeah.
Yesterday in like the global.
Well, if we talk about
scale,
geologic time, it was a second ago. But in human history, it's yesterday, right? And even at that point, they thought, and it's interesting because some of it's come full circle. A lot of those doctors were like, "Oh, these aren't mental ailments, physical ailments." And now we've sort of come full circle, and we're trying to be like, "Hey, they're all related." Many of our mental ailments could cause physical manifestations and vice versa, and the interplay of them. But yeah, it is. And the craziest thing about listening to Erik tell the story in such detail too is it's something we talk a lot about on the podcast, is how similar, right? No stories are the same, but you hear these sort of threads. It's, the pain, the anguish, the fixation, the mental anguish and suffering. And often it shows up almost that exact same way for just about everyone who has this affliction. And and Erik honestly was really lucky that Amy is who Amy is, and he was proactive and was there with him the whole time to make sure nothing that happened. And then when it didn't seem like he was going to improve, had the lifeline and could push. And then, has been his second biggest advocate after himself in his healing journey.
Speaking of healing, I have a question for both of y'all. Because there's a point where we have these issues and we don't have therapists, and then we do. So, and Eric, I want you to go first. Because I
Mhm.
want you to also tell me what a healing team is, because I think that has to do with therapy. So tell me the difference. And I am trying to sell therapy here.
Yeah.
I'm not getting any commissions, and there's all kinds of therapy now. You don't have to go sit in a traditional office and let some basic bitch look at you. If you don't know them, fuck the whore. You don't ever, well, not literally fuck the whore, but I mean, you could. But
I mean, that's a whole other.
fuck that hoe. Fuck that hoe. You don't have to tell her shit if you don't want to. There's psychedelic therapies, there's all kinds of therapies now. But what is the difference between trying to deal with all of this shit before you had help versus now that you do have help, and what is a healing team?
Sure. So, one, I'm a huge proponent of therapy, like huge. So, and yeah, like you said, there's all sorts of therapies out there, and no one type of therapy works for every person. Maybe there's a mix of different things. And so, yeah. So when I think about my life before therapy, so I'm kind of 30, from 7 years old to 33 years old is kind of what I remember. I'm sure there were manifestations of it before I was 7, but I remember just living in a state of like heightened panic. It's sort of like almost like white noise. So it was like this kind of low grade anxiety that was always with me. And I was always trying to make sure that nobody could see it. And so not only was I living with true mental illness, I was also trying to live a life that I wanted people to see. And it was exhausting. Anybody who's ever, in your audience who has ever suffered with anxiety or OCD or schizophrenia or any of the different diagnoses out there, it can be very exhausting and tiring in and of itself. Throw on top of that this facade that I tried to hold up through middle school and high school and college and grad school and work. And physically, I was just exhausted, and my physical health was pretty shitty. Mark knows this. It's always shocking when I show people photos. So to give your audience an idea, I'm coming off of the end of mountain bike season now, so I'm 5'9", about 150, 155 pounds. At the height of my living this facade and being mentally unhealthy, but also physically unhealthy in New York, I was pushing, 200 and almost 205 pounds. I was eating, food was a comfort for me. So just large quantities of food. And so it manifested itself both, with the mental illness issues, but also physically, my body was starting to break down. Life with therapy, I'm still in therapy now. I've added energy healing to that, and Reiki and mindfulness and meditation and all of the crazy stuff that we've talked about that I do outside, skiing and mountain biking and a little bit of surfing, and if you include lying bare ass naked on a Hawaiian beach as an activity, then we can add that to my activity list as well, and just being in the sun. But life after, and I'd be interested in some ways, Devan, because as I sit here and think about it, it's a completely different topic. But in many ways, I feel like when I finally started to tell someone about what was happening mentally, I can only envision that it's like somebody coming out for the first time, right? You have this tremendous secret that you've been holding on to for a very, 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 very long time. And when I finally revealed that secret, it was like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. And suddenly I found not only was I willing to talk to my therapist about it, but now I was willing to talk to my friends about it. And then I got to a point where I was like, I don't give a fuck who knows about it. Like, I want everybody to know. And in a weird way, it also gave me a sense of comfort and security because now, and we're getting into the healing teams, now I knew that other people around me knew what was going on. And so I almost felt like I had like a bunch of people who were there to also protect me. And we talk about chosen family, right? In the LGBTQ community a lot. And healing teams are in essence the same thing when it comes to mental health. And anybody can create a healing team. My healing team, it's my wife, it's Mark, it's my therapist, it's my energy healer, and some very close friends. And essentially those are people who know the really, really, really deep, dark secrets of like what I live with and know what my triggers are, know how to identify the external signs. So even if I'm feeling things internally and I'm not in a place where I'm even aware of it or ready to speak, from the outside, they can start to see that and kind of help guide me and be like, hey, maybe you should talk to Kathleen, who's our therapist. Or, you know what, maybe, you should dial back, on all the exercise you're doing. You're overdoing it, overstressing, right? So anybody can create a healing team. It's trusted people who are not going to judge you, who are there because they love you and they want to help you live with it and be able to move through these really difficult times.
Oh, the squad.
The squad. Yeah, it's like a squad.
Yeah, you can call it whatever you want.
Whatever you want. Whatever you want.
All right, break it down for us,
The
Mr.
plastics. There was a whole discussion around Mean Girls when I was at Louisville. And we're talking about the plastics and Regina George. So yeah, the plastics in a way were their own little squad, an evil squad, but a squad nonetheless.
Hey, I can tell the weather by my tits too. And so
Well,
that's a unique trait.
So Mark, what would tell us about how you feel like your life is different before therapy and after therapy and
so
also
my story is so much different. I'm sorry, finish your question.
then I also want to know like when you've had these depressive episodes for you, did it feel like you were being possessed or taken over by like a dark force or not?
It doesn't feel like not being possessed. So here's the deal. Like, I don't know. I've never been possessed, I guess. So, but for me, it often feels like the word I would use is ill. Like everything is just muted. Like I don't, and everyone thinks of depression as like, oh, you're just really sad. And for me, I would actually describe it as like, I actually don't feel terribly sad, but I also don't feel terribly happy. I don't feel much at all. It's kind of, for me, I'm obviously a very out there, excitable, boisterous person. And it goes to gray. Everything just kind of doesn't. And the hardest thing for me is usually starts with questioning my own self-worth and a sense of self-esteem. And I just don't think it's worth anything. I don't think I'm worth anything. I don't think the effort or doing the things are worth anything. And I was going to say, and that's why, I won't say that it isn't like being possessed, because there is this sense of it like comes in, like it comes over me. And, I'm really lucky. My wife's name is also Amy, which is one of our Eric and I's long running jokes. And she's one of the few people who can actually kind of see it on the periphery. I'm pretty good at like, getting through life, doing what I have to do, but she's very good at being like, are you all right? Do you need something? Do you need, and she's usually pretty good. She's like, do you need to go for a walk? Play your guitar? Like just something that, generally will kind of wake the brain back up. And for me, it was sort of an odd road because my first bout in therapy, I was put in therapy. I was 7 years old and I was a handful, for lack of a better term. My parents did not know what to do with me. And for any of you out there who have kids now, like I now have a confirmed adult ADHD diagnosis, but ADHD wasn't something that they diagnosed kids with in 1983. And so my first bout in therapy, I literally ended up at a hospital and was meeting with a panel of doctors. And my devious ass thought this was some bullshit. And I wasn't weird or special and didn't need this kind of treatment. So I was honestly often combative and verbally abusive and would lie and try to trick my therapists, and actually did trick them often. Like they would go into the room and be like, so he said this is happening. And my mom would be like, that's not happening. Why do you believe him? And they're like, he's very convincing. And then she's like, we know. We're aware. We live with them. That's part of the problem. And luckily or unluckily, one of the things they realized was that I had a very accelerated understanding of self and self-worth and maturity for that age. They tested me incessantly. I think I did every psychological exam. Like later in life, you're like working at some job and they give you one of those like, disc tests or one of these like personality things. And I would have these like weird flashbacks. Like, oh, yeah, I've done something like this before, except I was 7, and I don't even remember the number, but my IQ was like, at the top of the curve. And they basically told my parents that, I was healthy, but that I should almost call my mom to get it like word for word, but I had trouble with emotional management and anger management and couldn't self-regulate emotions. Like, the highest of highs, lowest of lows. But they didn't think I was bipolar. They did think I was dealing with lots of depression, self-worth. I wasn't getting along with or really making friends with kids my age because they weren't interested in or wanted to talk about the things that I wanted to do. So I just ignored them and thought they were all idiots and didn't want to hang out with them. So it was this really weird dichotomy, and life hasn't changed that much. Eric's laughing. He's like, Mark hasn't changed that.
That part of life. That part of you is the same.
And then luckily, my mom found a really great family counselor that we met with. And she did a lot of work with me she would use games and different things and then help me understand my reactions. And then basically taught me to self-regulate. And then not my second time in therapy, which was during college, but then my third time in therapy, which was just a few years ago, my therapist and I untangled that actually a lot of my behaviors and things have all been built as coping mechanisms. Some of how I would deal with other people, the relationships that I would grab onto that I felt safe in, were all coping mechanisms that were dealt essentially with dealing with early childhood trauma and trust issues and being ADHD. And it didn't, the interesting thing is my last month therapy didn't hugely revolutionize how I thought or felt, but it really validated and it gave me more power, I think, to be like, no, this doesn't feel good. This is why. And if I keep doing this, I'm going to end up here. So that's not going to work for me, especially when it came to regulating my emotions, especially when I dealt with anger or frustration, which that's the stuff that leads me towards anxiety and panic. And then from a depression standpoint, and I'm still not great at this, we all aren't great at self-talk, right? We're all pretty good at cutting ourselves down. And there's actually been studies that biologically there's a biological imperative for negative self-talk, because when we focus on ourselves versus focusing on the group at large, it's not a good thing. We should be focusing on our tribe, our family. That's how we all survive. One human alone in the wilderness doesn't do that good of a job. Not a person. And so there's actually a biological imperative for us not to spend a ton of time thinking about ourselves. So some of the studies now are wondering if that's why when we do get into this self-talk circle, that a lot of it is negative. And so it's been very difficult, and I'm still working on kind of shifting. And one of the things, two of the things Kathleen Callahan, our therapist, pushed me to is, one thing is, stop saying something to yourself that you wouldn't say to someone you cared about. Was like one of my number one kind of pushes. And the number two was, and this one is even stranger. When you're having those really negative self-thoughts, can you imagine anyone, even if they don't like you, thinking you're saying that about you? Can you verify? Is there any context? And, empirically, like 99.9% of the time, no. Is the answer, because we're so self-critical, and I am certainly the worst of it. And, giving yourself that permission to be kind to yourself and be caring and loving and cut yourself a little slack is just not something. And this isn't against my parents, my upbringing or anything, but I wasn't brought up in an environment at our generation, my age, where I grew up economically and physically, where like that, there wasn't time for, like you had to put up or shut up, take care of yourself, and from a very early age, part of it, being abandoned by my biological father and some of those things, like I was just convinced that self-reliance was the only thing. So I just pushed that to its failure, essentially. But
I
I'm
have
really
a
happy. Go ahead, man.
no finish.
But I'm really happy to be able to talk about that now, and not with no guilt, no judgment. I don't know if you can even hear that in my voice. It's just kind of like matter of fact. This is what I do. This is why I do it. And this is, and it's not, I can tell you, even when I say it out loud, sometimes it feels like a lie. I'm like, it's not my fault. It's, there's nothing wrong with me. And even when I say it, I'm like, there's that voice in the background. Is sure. But I'm going to keep saying it because it's true.
What I have a thank you for sharing that. I have a note in here about like a suicide. Did you have like a suicide attempt?
So I've never had an attempt. I've had multiple suicidal ideations, and there is a very strong and important difference, because I've never had a plan. But how my suicidal ideation shows up is, it's really kind of awful to even say it out loud, but I just imagine like how many of my loved ones' lives might be better without me, and how difficult of a person I can be, and how much thoughts and absolute pain that I live with in my head sometimes, like would it just all go away? And so it's not, I've never gone as far as planning, but I do sometimes have these crazy recurring thoughts about like driving my car off a cliff, or, these weird like little flashes. But the really hard ones come for like me planning, like, how great my wife's life would be. She wouldn't have to worry about this or do that, or, she wouldn't have to put up with this kind of shit I pull and like that. And if anyone out there is thinking like that, I just want you to know, like, A, it's real, and B, that is a slippery slope. Like, don't think like, oh, just because I've never planned to commit suicide, it's probably okay. It's not. You shouldn't be imagining a world without you. It's not good for you anyway, and it's not far off from you making.
So how do you overcome those kind of thoughts? And after you answer that, Eric, have you ever had those kind of thoughts? So
For me, that's where the healing team comes in. You contextualize or compare, right? Because I can tell you, my wife, it'd be funny to ask her this. I do wonder sometimes if my wife doesn't actually listen to the podcast, because it's hard enough for her to handle or deal with some of the things that I deal with, and she kind of has to shake me out of that. I don't think she probably wants to revisit that on a weekly basis like we do. And I never actually asked her. I think the reflection of understanding how loved I am and how important a role that I serve in other people's lives, and that I would just be leaving a giant hole in their lives, is the first step. The second step is learning that you're important enough to live for yourself. And that sounds very normal, I hope, to most of the people out there listening. Congratulations. You're not depressed. You don't have a suicidal ideation at this time, but it doesn't mean you won't. Because I've had periods where I don't, and then I had periods where I do. And for me, a lot of times it's overwhelm. It starts with overwhelm. Like I feel like I can't think my way or work my way out of the box that I'm in, and I get overwhelmed by being a caregiver, taking care of the people I care about, and then I already feel like I'm letting them down, which makes me feel like I'm letting myself down, and you can probably see how that kind of just leads to that.
Yeah, to take your question, Devanin, not in the way that Mark talks about it, but in the height of some of my panic attacks and heightened OCD and anxiety, where the intrusive thoughts are really terrifying and scary. I have had thoughts where I'm like, you know what, if this gets really bad, I can stop it from happening because I can reach into the cabinet right there and I can swallow that whole bottle of Klonopin, and that'll be the end of it. And then, but I won't actively think about it or hope for it or plan for it. The one that was really strange for me was this past November was, I had gone through a really difficult time with lots of things happening, and I was back in that OCD and anxiety, and I didn't feel like there was a way out. And I just remember I was out on a walk with one of my friends, so I was trying to at least get out and do some things that I enjoyed. And Mark wouldn't know the spot exactly, but I was out walking on Tom Lake Trail, which was kind of frozen over at the time. And right before we got there, we were kind of in Base Village here in Snowmass. I remember looking up, and I was looking up at some of the higher places on the mountain that I love to ski. And this weird voice in my head was like, "You're not going to be here to see it this winter. You're not going to be around to see it." And I couldn't figure out where that voice was coming from, why it was there. And I was talking to my therapist about it, and subsequently, right here, the PTSD diagnosis, came in. But that was probably kind of the closest realization that I ever had of thinking like, yeah, I may not be around in another couple weeks. And it kind of it dissipated. And I've never had any kind of thought like that again. But it's interesting how Mark and I talk about this a lot. If we were looking at a bookshelf, right? Mark's on one side, kind of depression, right? It's the worrying about, everything in the past. And there's the anxiety, which is kind of the future. And he and I have had other similar things kind of in the middle. But just because you are diagnosed with one or the other does not necessarily mean that you can't have manifestations of some other pieces and parts. Like I could have some of the depressive stuff.
Well, I
can
mean,
have
a
some of the
perfect
anxiety
example,
stuff. Yeah.
a perfect example is, what sent me into my last bout in talk therapy was essentially a panic attack. I had it right in front of someone, and it was a crisis of consciousness is what I would say. Like my mind was just I couldn't operate anymore. It was all filled up. If you think about this idea that Erik brought up about like holding up the masks and, doing it. And I'll never forget like sitting down with my therapist and just being like, yeah, it was just weird. I usually have all the answers, but all of a sudden I couldn't find them. And she was like, yeah, you were panicked. You were in a full fight or flight. And I was like, no, I'm depressed. She's like, Jesus, will you just listen? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Okay. Well, then say something that makes sense. And she's like, do you feel depressed right now? Look at you. She's like, I can tell your heart rate's up. She's like, you're sweating. She's like, that's not depression. She's like, now, I'm not saying this isn't being caused by your depression. And so it is this like weird interplay. And, you know, and for me, I've not even really joking, but I've always described it as like an existential crisis. Because for me, I'm like, you know, where does my worth come from? Where does the meaning come from? And I've always thought that the answer would be within, that I would somehow find that answer. I've even written song lyrics about that now that I think about it. But the fact of the matter is that meaning and that, you know, it comes from everywhere. It comes from within, without, with other people, you know, and being able to understand that. And it doesn't always work that way for me in my brain. I have to remind myself that worth doesn't, like, I didn't just land on this planet, achieve or do something that would somehow prove my self-worth. Like, it comes from literally having a conversation, two beautiful men discussing like how we're going to get through this when these kinds of things happen to us. And, you know, being there
Happen for us.
and for us, right? Right. And, you know, being there for the people I care about, however I am that day, whatever version of myself, even if it isn't my best, it's better than not. Right. And that's, it's even hard for me to say, like, you know, I'm not fully there. I never will be, I don't think.
And I'm just going to reiterate something Mark said for your audience, that any version of yourself is better than no version of yourself. So anybody out there who's thinking, as Mark was describing, you know, my family will be better off without me, my friends, I'm a burden, you know, I just can't seem to be myself. It's perfectly okay. I'm gonna ad lib a little bit on my saying it's perfectly okay to not always be yourself, but be some version of yourself.
I love it. I love it. So, Eric, what song is Mark gonna play?
Right. So
I'm not ready for him to play it just yet. That's gonna be about
yeah.
5 minutes.
Oh, he just wants me to prepare.
So he
Yeah.
can,
Right, so just gotta prepare. So I saw this artist, Mark knows who it is. I saw this artist about 3 weeks ago in Denver, and it's somebody who lives on the North Shore of Oahu in Hawaii, and whose music I love. And Mark and I play a lot of his stuff together. But it's going to be the first Jack Johnson song that Mark actually taught me how to play. And it's going to be Rodeo Clowns.
Oh, I totally thought you were going to make me play A Pirate Looks at 40 by myself.
No. Rodeo
Listen,
Clowns,
I will
G-Love,
tell you right
Ben
now,
Harper, Jack Johnson, they've all played it separately and together.
I will do my best, and Eric will laugh. There is one section of the lyrics that I always screw up, so we'll see if I can get that to actually get it right.
Well, feel free to remix it, chop it, screw it. You don't have to do the whole thing all the way
It's
through.
only four chords. You remember the chords, Mark?
Oh, I know the chords.
Okay, so you just
I'm going to do the easy part for me.
So I've appreciated y'all's candidacy. I guess we're getting too close to the midterms. I want to say candidacy, but you know,
I am never running for fucking political office. Fuck all of them. 535 useless people in Washington, D.C.
I don't know. I've considered it a couple times.
Well, you certainly can't hurt anything.
And you know what? There's no skeleton they're gonna dig out of either one of our closets that isn't already out there. So
That's true.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I take my skeletons out to the bar all the time. So, I mean,
some of my best friends are my
I was
skeletons.
going to say many of them are my best friends.
they did great bait. They don't have any room to judge, and they don't try.
That's right.
So,
You were there too, motherfucker.
A little too bony for me, as Mark knows. I'm an ass guy. So yeah.
It's true.
so thank you for sharing about your healing journey and everything like that. I'm a proponent of alternative medicines, be it hypnotherapy. I'm on a new psychedelic journey, which when I have you back on for the third time, and I'm going to have to because I still have more things on my bullet points that I have gotten to. I look forward to having you back on, and then we can talk about my MDMA experience,
Yes. Yes, yes,
psilocybin
yes.
experience, and my new beard coloring experience. I'm headed to Portland, baby, and I'm returning not the same.
Are they ready though? Are they really ready for you in Portland?
They have no choice.
No, but I just want to know.
I've been just once before, and I'm gonna tell you, that city, I never thought I'd say this, is too wild for me. Like,
What?
that
Wait,
city
wait. Say that again?
I don't believe this.
No.
that city is too wild for me, and at least, like, the gay division, because there's so much I'm gonna say that, like,
That should be the name of our band, Mark. Like the Joy Division,
The
right?
gay division.
The Gay Division.
like, me as at this person who I am now, yes. If I would have been in my mid to late 20s when I was a drug dealer, no, I would have fit in fine. But there's far too much for me, just like narcotics, just like running around freely because everything is illegal there. It's just like thrown at you. So might go somewhere to like have a little bit of this or a little bit of that, and then everybody starts showing up with everything else they have. Then everybody else they know a new dealer who's also on the way. And before you're done, you have like 15 people with all this bags of dope laying around, things like that, and it's just too much. You know, you know. It
I
was
saw
my
that
first-
big grin on Mark's face when you said
I'm just
Don't
reminding myself of my early partying days where I would, sometimes it is important that the drugs run out. Because if the drugs don't run out, that's when shit gets really weird. And I can tell that Anna knows what I mean.
Just did like the drug not run out.
Mom, if you're listening right now, I'm sorry. That shit went down. And it is like and look, and I'll tell you, I haven't actually used psychotropics as part of my own supervised mental health journey, but I can definitely tell you that I remember points in my life, especially right in college or just after college, which is, some of the most fucked up times of your life chemically. Like, as a guy, our brains are just finally finishing developing, you're working jobs, you're starting to sort out what you are. And I can tell you, especially, I'm thinking specifically of a long, long mushroom trip in the desert in my early 20s, and coming back from that with a very different understanding of self, meaning I was a lot less attached, and like talk about ego and these things. And like, I think sometimes part of what can send us into a very, and this is going to sound a bit stranger, but can send us into a very hard part, especially for someone who fixates, whether it's anxiety or depression. You get so attached to yourself and who you are and what's important. I think sometimes it's important to take the sledgehammer to that shit and be like, do you have clean water? Do you have some food? Do you have some people that love you? Then you're fine, and I think we need to know that sometimes.
Amen and a fucking men to all of that. That's my takeaway from this is it's important that the drugs run out.
That's certainly how for me, it's like, okay, we're out. I'm going to walk out of the desert now and go.
I have no problem if that's what you want to name this episode today. In honor of Mark.
Sometimes the drugs should run out. It's
important the drugs run out.
There's a great Dan Harper song called The Drugs That Don't Work. And it's like, yeah, they worked for a little while, but then they don't. And that's when they should run out.
All right, Mark.
Is it my turn?
Serenade us, if you will.
Yes, my guitar is in the other room, so I get to sit back and enjoy.
This is Eric's guitar.
That is my guitar that he's playing. Sorry.
That was what was on the shelf. You guys hear that pretty well?
Mm-hmm.
Sweeping the floors, open up the doors, yeah, turn on the light, getting ready for tonight. Nobody's romancing cause it's too early for dancing, but here comes the music. Bright lights flashing to cover up your lack of so many people, so many reasons why another round, trickling down, just the numbing out of the town. With the big man, better than the other man. He's got the plan with the $1 million in the depth. Oh, no one understands it. We're gonna big man, but lights the passion. I'm gonna say him with the cherries here. You're swinging down on there. It's the ship rolling in the fire on there. You're swinging down on there. And just gonna let it go out. Yes. Fair enough. But I think the content number, so I decided you need to remember the whole thing, unless you really want me to. Just.
No, that's super cute. I thank you so much for playing that. I love that chord. It almost sounds like they could have led right in the Hotel California.
Yeah, it's a minor summer. That's what gives it that like. One bird and very jazz. Yeah, you could play it at night too. Yeah, I know, and it makes me happy. Actually, you know what? There's one more verse I'm gonna play for you because it's important.
Are you in there? Are you plugged into the amp? Oh, there's like massive feedback
On the guitar?
Yeah,
from
at
your
first
voice.
it wasn't, now it is.
Yeah, from your voice.
your voice too, everything's changed.
While I was singing, or just when I stopped? I wonder if it changed the settings.
Both.
Trip.
Yeah.
If there's something worse, I can do like a quick native recording of it and send it to you, Bazan.
Okay. Mark's voice changed during the podcast. He finally went through puberty at 46.
It's actually asking me to set up professional audio and audio settings. So I must be too loud or freaked out.
Saying something. So
Yeah.
oh well, we'll just go ahead and have our last words. Then your last words to the world, Eric, and then Mark, and you can do a little light strum while Eric is talking. It'll be
Yeah. Yeah, do a little. There you go. So soothing, right?
right.
So I just want to say to your audience and everybody who's listening out there, just remember you're not alone. There's hope, there's help, and there is a way through. And from this day forward, none of us should have to suffer alone or in silence.
Remember, if you can listen to the music, it'll set you free, right? And I don't mean just the music. I mean the sound of your voice, the sound of your lover's voice, the sound of your parent, sister, brother, whoever it is. Key in, be present, because in the present moment, we can always be happy with ourselves. The moment that happened a moment before and the moment that hasn't happened yet, it's really fine. It's really difficult to find happiness and joy in those. But the one right now, that one you can find it in.
And as my favorite song by Dave Cause, Start All Over Again, would say, as long as you are breathing, you can start all over again. If your heart's beating, you can start all over. Goodbye, sorrow. You can start all over again. Hello, tomorrow. You can start all over.
Well said, sir.
You've unleashed a hidden talent here of the Vanners, Mark.
Oh, honey, my mouth is good for more than deep throating. Yeah. But I will say it's easier to hit that G sharp after I've sucked on a good long bone to just stretch your feet out back there. So thank you all for coming again onto the Sex, Drugs, and Jesus podcast. The name of their show is Survivor to Thriver. And all of their links will go in the showy notes, as it always does. And they will be back on again. And we're going to talk more about some cat fuckery. And we're going to talk more about Erik and his history. So we will talk to you all soon. Love to you and peace to you. Be safe in all you do. Thank you all so much for taking time to listen to the Sex, Drugs, and Jesus podcast. It really means everything to me. Look, if you love the show, You can find more information and resources at sexdrugsandjesus.com or wherever you listen to your podcast. Feel free to reach out to me directly at devannon@sexdrugsandjesus.com and on Twitter and Facebook as well. My name is Devannon, and it's been wonderful being your host today. And just remember that everything is going to be all right.